Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into an essential aspect of Spring Boot, configuring the context path and port for your REST API. These settings help you control where your application is accessible and on which port it runs, providing greater flexibility and control over your deployment. Ready to customize your Spring Boot application? Let's get started. First, let's understand what the context path is and why it's important. The context path is the base URL path used to access your application. By default, the context path is /, which means your application is accessible at the root URL. For example, if your application is running on http://localhost 8080/, then the context path / allows you to access it directly at this URL. But why is the context path important? Configuring the context path allows you to change this base path, which is incredibly useful for several reasons. Organizing multiple applications. Suppose you're running multiple applications or microservices on the same server. Setting different context paths for each service helps avoid URL conflicts and keeps everything neatly organized. For example, you might have one service at localhost 8080/app1 and another at localhost 8080/app2. Avoiding conflicts. If you're deploying multiple applications under the same domain, unique context paths ensure that requests are routed to the correct application without any overlap. Improve security. By not exposing your application directly at the root URL, you can add an extra layer of security and make it less predictable and accessible to unauthorized users. Better scalability. Context paths make it easier to scale and manage large applications by clearly defining and separating different components or services. Imagine your organization has a client who uses your services. You've given them a domain URL like https://example.com. Now, let's say you have two microservices running behind this domain. Both microservices have an endpoint called /generate_token. If both services are accessed through the same domain, it becomes confusing for the client to know which API they are hitting. For instance, microservice A for user authentication, https://example.com/generate_token. Microservice B for payment processing, https://example.com/generate_token. Without proper context paths, the client wouldn't know if they're hitting the authentication token generator or the payment token generator. This could lead to serious mix-ups and potential errors. By configuring context paths, we can solve this problem efficiently. For example, microservice A, user authentication, could be accessed at https://example.com/user-service/generate_token. Microservice B, payment processing, could be accessed at https://example.com/payment-service/generate_token. This way, the client can clearly differentiate between the two services and their respective endpoints. https://example.com/user-service/generate_token for authentication tokens. https://example.com/payment-service/generate_token for payment tokens. Configuring context paths not only avoids confusion but also helps in organizing and managing multiple services under a single domain effectively. Ready to see how we can set this up in Spring Boot? Let's dive in and configure the context paths for our microservices. Alright, let's get started. Before we dive into configuring the context path, we need to clean up our project a bit. In the last video, we created a custom message converter along with the webconfig, custom controller, custom, and custom message converter classes. Great! Now that we've cleaned up our project, let's move on to configuring the context path. First, let's open the application.properties file. In Spring Boot, configuring the context path is a breeze. Spring provides a handy property that we can simply override in our application.properties file. All we need to do is set the server.servlet.contextPath property to define our desired context path. This way, we can customize the base URL for our application, making it more organized and easier to manage. Add the property server.servlet.contextPath to set the context path to /employee service. This tells Spring Boot to use /employee service as the base URL for our application. Start the application. Our application is up and running. Now, let's switch over to Postman. Hit any of the employee service APIs. I'm going to test the getEmployeeById API. As you can see on the screen, we got a 404 not found error. That's because we've configured our context path to /employee service. Previously, we were hitting localhost 8080/employee/1, but now that path doesn't exist anymore. We need to update our request URL to include the new context path. The context path comes right after the domain in the URL. So, our updated URL should be localhost 8080/employee service/employee/1. Let's update the URL in Postman and send the request again. As you can see on the screen, this time we got a successful response. Our API call to localhost 8080/employee service/employee/1 worked perfectly. Now, you can access all the endpoints of the employee service by adding the context path to the URL. As you can see on the screen, our server is currently running on port 8080. But what if we want to run our server on a different port, like 8081 or any other port? Spring Boot makes this super easy with another configuration property called server.port. By setting this property in our application.properties file, we can change the port on which our application runs. All we need to do is add server.port followed by the desired port number. Add server.port equals 8081. This tells Spring Boot to run the application on port 8081 instead of the default 8080. Restart the application to see our changes take effect. Look at the screen. You can see our server is now running on port 8081. This confirms that our configuration change worked perfectly. Now, let's switch over to Postman to test our configuration. First, let's try hitting the getEmployeeById API on port 8080 to see what happens. As you can see, we're not getting any response. That's because our server is no longer running on port 8080. Now, let's update the URL to port 8081 and hit the API again. Look at that. This time, our API reached the server successfully, and we got the proper response. This confirms that our server is up and running smoothly on the new port 8081. Now, if you ever need to run your server on a different port, you might think it requires changing the application.properties file and rebuilding the application every time. That sounds a bit tough, right? Don't worry. There's an easier way. When you start your server, you can add the server.port property to your VM options. This allows you to change the port on the fly without modifying the application.properties file. The value you provide with server.port will override the value in the application.properties. Alright, let's see how we can run our server on a different port using VM options in IntelliJ. Follow along with me. At the top of IntelliJ, where you usually run your application, look for the Employee Service Application configuration. Click on it, and you'll see an edit option. Go ahead and click on that. A new window will pop up with various options like the Java version, the main class to run, and more. Look for the Modify options. Click on it, and you'll see a lot of additional options. From these options, select VM options. In the VM options field, add server.port equals 8090 because we want our server to run on port 8090. Click Apply and then OK. Now, let's start the application. As you can see in the logs, our application has started on port 8090 this time. Let's open Postman to verify this. First, try hitting the GetEmployeeById API on port 8081. Notice that there's no response because our server is no longer running on that port. Now, update the URL to port 8090 and hit the API again. Look at that. This time, our API reached the server successfully, and we got the proper response. To summarize, we've learned how to configure the context path and change the server port in Spring Boot. Whether through the application.properties file or using VM options, you've seen how flexible and easy it is to manage these settings. Thank you for joining me in this session. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you next time.